The Echoing Footsteps. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The wind howled through the empty streets, its cold breath biting at the skin, carrying with it a sense of something lurking just out of sight. Inside the old house, the creaking of the wooden beams was the only sound that dared to break the oppressive silence. Lila sat in the dim light of the fireplace, her eyes flicking nervously to the shadowy corners of the room, each one seeming to conceal something that wasn't quite right. She wasn't alone, though. She could feel it, like a presence pressing against the air, suffocating, tightening. Her mind wandered back to that day, the day she had moved into this forgotten corner of the world. The real estate agent had been quick to assure her that the house was charming, though there was an undercurrent of unease that she'd noticed in his eyes when he spoke about it. That night, as Lila unpacked her belongings, she began to hear the sound. At first, it was just faint, like a tap or a scrape, but then it grew louder, clearer, as if someone or something was moving around the house with deliberate care. She dismissed it as the house settling, old wood groaning, wind rattling through the broken windows. But it was no longer something she could ignore. Every night, it came back. Those footsteps. It started softly, a single step in the hallway, followed by a second. Then nothing. Silence. Lila told herself it was the old pipes, the house-esque works. But as the days passed, the footsteps grew more insistent, more rhythmic. By the third night, they were loud enough to wake her from sleep, echoing down the hall, stopping just outside her bedroom door. She lay still, frozen under the covers, the sound of those footsteps thudding in her chest like a second heartbeat. But no one came. That was when Lila began to wonder if she was losing her mind. She never believed in ghosts, or spirits, or anything supernatural. But what else could it be? No one else was there, yet the footsteps never ceased. Every night, they marched through the house, as if something was pacing the hallways, waiting, watching. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, a soft murmur just beyond the edge of hearing, but they grew clearer with each passing day. "Leave," they whispered. "Go. Now." Lila had thought about leaving, of course. She could pack up and move to another place, find somewhere normal, where the walls didn't breathe and the floors didn't groan with the weight of something unseen. But something kept her there, something deeper, something she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the isolation, the desire to prove to herself that she wasn't afraid. Maybe it was the house itself, clinging to her, drawing her in. She couldn't say for sure, but she stayed. And then the dreams started. Lila would close her eyes, and in the dream, she would find herself walking down the same dark hallways she had heard footsteps in. The air was thick with the smell of rot, the walls closing in on her with every step. The footsteps were always there, behind her, keeping pace as if they were a part of her own shadow. And she knew, without a doubt, that if she turned around, if she looked into the dark behind her, she would see it, the thing that had been following her all along. Each time she woke from those dreams, her heart would race, her body soaked in cold sweat, the echo of those footsteps still ringing in her ears. She began to question her sanity, her grip on reality slipping with each passing day. The house felt like it was closing in, its walls pressing tighter against her, its very foundation quivering with anticipation. On the seventh night, Lila could take it no longer. She had to know what was happening. She had to confront the footsteps, the whispers, the thing that had been haunting her since she first set foot in this house. Armed with nothing but a candle and the faintest remnants of courage, she stood at the threshold of the hallway, staring into the dark beyond. The footsteps were there, louder than ever before, echoing down the hall, thudding against the floor like a heartbeat. She took a tentative step forward, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears. One step, then another, and then another, until she was standing at the top of the stairs, the darkness swallowing the rest of the house. "Who is there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of her own voice bouncing off the walls, lost in the emptiness. She took another step, descending the stairs with a shaky hand gripping the railing, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. The footsteps were getting louder, and she knew, without a doubt, that they were following her, just behind her, a breath away. Lila reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes straining to pierce the blackness. She could feel it now, the presence that had been with her all along. It was close, so close, its breath cold against her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing. No one. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. She could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. The house felt different now. It felt alive, as if it were breathing, pulsing with an energy that was not her own. And then, as the silence stretched on, Lila heard it again, only this time, it was not the echo of footsteps. It was a laugh. Soft, hollow, and low, coming from somewhere in the darkness. A sound that crawled under her skin and made her blood run cold. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time, so close she could feel the words on her skin. "It's too late." But Lila couldn't move. Her legs wouldn't obey her, frozen in place by the weight of the sound, the fear clawing at her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for the source of the voice, but there was nothing but the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. Then she saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, just out of the reach of the candle light, something shifted. It was dark, impossible to see clearly, but she knew in the deepest part of her soul that it was watching her. The shape was tall, thin, its form shifting, almost liquid, as if it was made of darkness itself. And then it moved. Lila screamed, her voice breaking the silence, but it was too late. The darkness engulfed her, swallowing her whole, pulling her into the abyss. The last thing she heard was the sound of those footsteps, echoing in the void. And then, there was only silence. Lila's world went black, and for a moment, she lost all sense of time, the air around her thick with cold and fear. She couldn't feel the floor beneath her feet anymore, as if the ground had vanished, leaving her suspended in an endless void. The footsteps that had tormented her for so long now seemed distant, like a memory fading into the vast nothingness. Then, just as suddenly as it had taken her, the darkness released its grip. Lila found herself back in the hallway, standing at the foot of the stairs. But the house was different now. It wasn't the place she had come to know. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thick with a musty, suffocating scent that made her gag. Her pulse pounded in her temples, and every step she took felt heavier, as if the very atmosphere of the house was pressing down on her, unwilling to let her leave. The house was no longer silent. The footsteps no longer mere echoes repeated their relentless rhythm, but now they sounded closer, as though they were just behind her, pacing in perfect sync with her own movements. Lila's breath quickened, and she turned, half expecting to see anything in the dark. But there was only the black void stretching before her, and the incessant sound of those footsteps, following her, never leaving her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her legs were heavy, as though weighted down by the very air that surrounded her. With each step, the feeling of being hunted grew stronger, an overwhelming sensation that something was watching her every move, studying her every breath. The footsteps were a constant, their echoes swallowing all other sound. Lila stumbled back toward the living room, her eyes frantically scanning the room for some kind of escape, some way to break free from the endless cycle of footsteps. But when she entered, the room was no longer the same. The furniture was gone, only the shadows remained. The fireplace, once a welcoming source of light and warmth, was now cold and empty, its hearth blackened with soot and ash. And in the center of the room, standing still in the deepening darkness, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and as Lila's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw it was draped in tattered, dark clothing, as if it had wandered through the halls of this forsaken house for years, its form decaying with each passing moment. The air around it seemed to ripple, as though reality itself was warping in its presence. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but Lila felt it staring at her, its gaze penetrating her very soul. Her heart raced, and in a moment of pure panic, she took a step backward, but the footsteps that had followed her so relentlessly now filled the room, surrounding her, trapping her in a never-ending circle. Each footstep was louder than the last, and she couldn't escape. The house had become a labyrinth, each corner darker and more oppressive than the last, each hallway stretching longer, the walls closing in tighter. "Who are you?" Lila croaked, her voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond, its body unmoving. Yet, in the suffocating silence, Lila could hear the whisper again, though this time, it was much clearer. "You shouldn't have stayed." Lila gasped, the words cutting through her like a blade. The figure remained silent, but Lila knew it was responsible for the footsteps, for the whispers, for the madness that had taken hold of her mind. It was the thing that had been following her, that had been waiting for her to crack, to break, to let it in. "No," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible against the din of the footsteps. "No. I want to, leave me alone." Her body trembled uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself, to keep from falling to her knees. But the floor beneath her was shifting, as if the very foundation of the house was alive, alive with malice, with hunger. "You can't escape." The voice, cold and distant, came again, as if it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This place is yours now. It's always been yours." Lila's breath hitched in her throat, and a terrible realization began to take root deep within her. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It had chosen her. The footsteps had been its way of calling her, luring her into its depths, where she would become part of it, part of the endless, spiraling nightmare that it created. The floor beneath her groaned, and Lila felt herself being pulled downward, her feet sinking into the wooden boards as though they were made of sand, soft and crumbling. She screamed, trying to pull away, but it was no use. The house had her now. It was too late. As she was dragged deeper into the floor, she saw the figure move slowly, deliberately toward her, its footsteps echoing in time with hers, the rhythm of its approach growing louder, faster. And then, just before she was swallowed completely by the earth beneath her, it spoke once more. "You'll never leave." The last thing Lila saw was the figure's face, twisted and ghastly, its features distorted by time and decay, before the world was swallowed by darkness once again. When the neighbors came by the next morning, they found the house as they always did, silent. Abandoned, the doors locked, the windows covered with dust and grime. They wondered about the strange girl who had lived there, the one who had moved in so quickly and never left. They wondered why the house never seemed to be quite right, why the air always felt heavy, as if something were waiting just out of view. But most of all, they wondered why, 4 weeks after, they heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls of that house, echoing in the dead of night. And they never dared to ask what, or who, was following them. The house remained silent for several days after Lila's disappearance, its hollowed-out rooms and dust-filled corridors undisturbed by human presence. Yet, to those who dared to walk too close, to the curious souls who stood near the overgrown garden or the rusted gate, the air was thick with something unspoken, something alive. The wind carried a weight, a heaviness that settled on anyone who passed by. It was as if the house itself were waiting, watching, even in its abandonment. A week passed before anyone entered again, drawn by a strange compulsion, one that seemed to come from within the house itself. A group of local teenagers, eager to prove their bravery, whispered among themselves about the eerie tales they'd heard, stories of the footsteps, of the house that had driven its last occupant mad. They had heard the rumors, the tales passed down from one fearful resident to the next, stories of strange occurrences and things that couldn't be explained. It was an old house, sure, but there was something more to it. Something that none could quite name. They gathered in front of the house, their hearts racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration. They dared one another to enter, laughing nervously as they crossed the threshold, the front door creaking open as if welcoming them. The air inside was heavy with dust and time, but there was also a strange sense of stillness, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they made their way through the hallway, their voices echoing off the walls, the youngest of the group, a boy named Sam, noticed something strange. There was a distinct smell in the air, something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. He wrinkled his nose, glancing around, but none of the others seemed to notice. "Come on, let's check out the basement," one of the others, Jake, said, his voice laced with excitement. They made their way toward the stairs, each step groaning under their weight. As they descended into the darkness, their flashlights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and the floor was littered with broken furniture, old boxes, and things better left unseen. They explored the space, their voices getting quieter, the oppressive feeling in the air tightening around them. They were looking for something, though none of them could quite say what. Something that would explain the stories they'd heard, the things they had been told in hushed voices. And then, it began. A faint sound, at first, barely noticeable over the sound of their own footsteps and laughter. It was the unmistakable rhythm of a footfall. Slow. Measured. It echoed through the basement, and for a moment, they all froze. Sam's heart skipped a beat as he glanced around, but he saw nothing. No one. "Did you hear that?" Sam whispered, his voice tight. The others, still oblivious, brushed it off as the house settling, or perhaps the wind. But Sam couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the house with them. The air grew colder, and the sound of footsteps became clearer, louder, as though it was approaching them, though they couldn't see anyone. The basement was empty, or so it seemed. The others began to laugh again, nervously, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. But Sam wasn't so sure. He could feel the presence. It was there, in the shadows, in the corners, like something waiting. Watching. The footsteps grew closer, and the flickering flashlight beams bounced erratically off the walls. A sudden cold gust of wind sent a chill down their spines. They turned to head back upstairs, but as they reached the staircase, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. The group screamed, rushing to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sam could hear the sound now, clearer than ever, the deliberate, echoing footsteps, as if someone was pacing in the hallway just beyond the basement door, walking back and forth. And then came the whisper. "Leave, now." It was the same whisper, the same chilling, hollow voice Lila had heard. The words pierced through the basement like a blade. The walls seemed to pulse with something alive, something malevolent, and the very air itself felt charged with a strange energy, a weight they couldn't comprehend. Panic set in. They scrambled at the door, pulling and pushing with all their might, but the handle refused to turn. The room grew darker, and the footsteps outside grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like an army of feet marching in perfect rhythm, surrounding them, closing in. Sam, heart pounding, his breath shallow, finally turned back toward the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. One of them, Jenna, grabbed his arm, her fingers cold and trembling. "We need to get out now," she gasped. But as they turned to rush for the stairs, the steps grew louder, almost deafening now, and the door at the top of the stairs creaked open slowly. And there, standing at the top of the stairs, was the figure. It was tall, far too tall for any human. Its form seemed to shift and blur, like smoke caught in a terrible wind. It was draped in tattered, dark clothing, and its face was an abyss, a hollow space of nothingness. There was no feature, no eyes, no mouth. Just an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. It stared at them, its presence overwhelming, filling the room with an oppressive sense of dread. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the air grew even colder. Time seemed to slow. "Leave." The voice, distorted, echoed through their minds. It was both everywhere and nowhere. It was the voice of the house, of the darkness itself. With a desperate cry, Sam lunged toward the door again, his body trembling. The others followed, pushing and shoving, their limbs stiff with fear. They fought to escape the basement, their eyes never leaving the figure, which seemed to be growing closer, its form shifting in unnatural ways. Finally, with one last desperate effort, the door flew open. They spilled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. But when they turned to run, the footsteps resumed, this time coming from behind them, echoing through the house, getting closer with each passing second. They ran, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the shadows in the hall twisted and reached out toward them, as though the very walls of the house were alive, pulling them back, refusing to let them leave. The footsteps followed, always there, never stopping. Somehow, they managed to escape the house, stumbling out into the cold, dark night. They didn't stop running until the house was far behind them, its windows dark and empty. But the footsteps, they never stopped. As they collapsed in the safety of the street, breathless and covered in sweat, they swore they could still hear them, faint but persistent. The echo of footsteps in the distance. And somewhere, deep within the house, a laugh, a hollow, guttural laugh resonated through the night. And they knew, without a doubt, that they had heard the last of the house. But the house, it had not yet finished with them. The end.